Hi, it's 5 o'clock here in Silver Spring outside of Washington, D.C. So good evening to those of you on the East Coast and good afternoon to those of you in the middle of the country or in the West. We're so happy that you've invited us. My colleague, Dr. Liz Anderson, and myself, Dale Lupu, we're going to talk to you today about maintaining emotional balance in an unbalanced time. So Liz, would you just say a little bit about your background?
Yes, thank you. So I am Liz Anderson and I am a social worker. Originally, I practiced as a hospice and palliative care social worker and bereavement counselor. And I also practiced as social services director for Mid-Atlantic Renal Coalition. I am now assistant professor of social work at Western Carolina University in Western North Carolina. But I have been very passionate for many years about the marriage between my two jobs as a hospice social worker and as social services director for Mid-Atlantic Renal Coalition. And so I have had the pleasure of working with Dale and many others passionate about this work and doing research on how do we really help people that are suffering from kidney disease and a whole lot of the other stuff going on today.
Thanks, Liz. I'm Dale Lupu. I'm a research professor at George Washington University. And like Liz, my career kind of started in the hospice palliative care arena. And that's where I became very acquainted with the tools that we have that are available to help people have what I call a softer landing at the end of life. And it's only in the past decade or so that I've begun to work in this bridge area, bridging palliative care and care of people who have kidney disease, and have gotten involved with the Coalition for Supportive Care of Kidney Patients. And I'm also co-directing the Pathways Project, where we're implementing a number of best practices around supportive care in dialysis centers and with people with CKD. So today, let's go to the next slide. Today, we are going to try to be a little interactive. You know, it's hard on these webinars when we don't see each other. But when COVID came and kind of upended the world, one of the first things that everyone had to deal with in dialysis centers was infection control. And that was obviously, the first thing that had to happen. But we also started to hear just how hard it all was for patients, for their families, and for the staff at dialysis centers. And so Liz and I and our colleagues at the Coalition developed, I sort of think of it as PPE for the emotions, like to hand you, somebody's going to hand you a face mask, but we want to hand you some words and some approaches that can help with the emotional upheaval that's happening in the dialysis center. So there are three strategies we're going to talk about today. Acknowledging and responding to the anxiety and fear. A second strategy might not be so obvious, and that's just recognizing that the dialysis center can be a source of stability for patients, and how do we enhance that? And then the third is, how do we honor the memory of patients who have died? So those are the three topics we're going to approach. And I think especially on the first one, for those of you who are social workers, and it's my understanding that a lot of folks who are participating today will likely be social workers. And if you would you type into the chat what your roles are, just so we begin to know who you are? So I think for many of you, the things we're going to go over on responding to anxiety and fear, they may be basic. They are things you probably already know. But I find it's useful sometimes to go back to basics and be reminded of how much I do know. So Liz, you want to take it away to the next area?
Is that right?
Yeah.
On the right slide. Okay.
Yeah. So I think you're going to go over the strategies. Yes.
Okay. So Yes, and I also am trying to figure out how to screen share and see chats, and I think that might be hard. So, Dale,
Okay,
if
so
you
I'll
don't
tell
mind.
you when, so let me just tell you that so far, almost everybody is a social worker in either a dialysis clinic or social worker. Yeah, so far. Okay, everyone's social workers. RN, okay, we have an RN in dialysis. All right.
Fantastic. So we are going to talk about 3 strategies to respond to anxiety and fear. So one of the things that we know is it is really hard for patients, or really any of us, to do anything if we have a lot of ongoing anxiety and fear. And I don't know about you, but since March, I feel like I've had many moments where I've said, you know what, I can't concentrate, can't focus, can't listen because I've got all this anxiety and fear about what's happening. And so that's happening to our patients and to us, our colleagues as well. So we believe that if we can address those things, then we're also going to be able to make progress in other areas. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is how do we connect and invite responses? So really, what can we do to pull patients and their caregivers in to have an opportunity to dialogue with us? So one of the things I always say is emotion is there whether or not you acknowledge it. If you do acknowledge it, you have a capacity to really have a positive impact on the emotional well-being of your client. So connecting and inviting that. And then the second part is acknowledging that emotion. So being able to name it and identify it. And then the last one is reminding our patients about resilience. Okay. So we're going to talk about these next 3 slides or summarize what we just brought up. So the first thing with connecting and inviting patients and caregivers to talk about their experience. So one of the things that we know is that oftentimes people do not like to admit that they are upset or that they are shut down. And if you think about it, we are all sort of socialized into this world, you know, at very early ages. Oh, hush, cry, don't cry, you know, wipe away those tears, chin up, right? So we early on get messaging that negative emotions aren't tolerated. And sometimes that's appropriate because, you know, I don't need to run into you in the grocery store and start sobbing in aisle 3, right? Like that wouldn't be appropriate. And yet, when we have something like a major pandemic, we have all of this social unrest happening, there is a lot of emotion. And so those skills of like pulling ourselves together don't work and sometimes actually cause harm when we're going through something really heavy. And so what we need to remember is that this is tough territory sometimes for people, and they are probably avoiding it, and that's hard, but we can give them permission to talk about this. And so we've got a couple of examples here of just how we can open it up. And I think it's just normalizing it. Just saying, you know, I'd like to hear what's on your mind about COVID. One of my favorite things to say is the sometimes statement. And so I'll say sometimes patients tell me, or sometimes caregivers tell me, or sometimes my friends tell me that this is really scary. And I'm just wondering, can you tell me a little bit about what it's like for you? So really being intentional about how we open up and invite those conversations is important. Right now, what I'd really like to do is spend a little bit of time talking about emotion. So as I said, we are often socialized out of emotion. And actually, most of us only have about 7 emotional words in our vocabulary. So if I gave each of you 1 minute to write down every single emotion you could think of, the average person can only come up with 7. Yet, there are so many emotions out there. So what we thought would be nice is if you would in the chat right now, write 3 emotion words to describe like maybe the pulse of the feel in your dialysis clinic. So if you could type in 3 emotional words, we're going to kind of come back to that. That would be great. They can be negative and horrible, and they can also be positive. We don't care. We can tolerate all kinds. So I'm going to just give you a minute to do that.
And then Liz, you can't see them easily, right?
Yeah. Oh, I just pulled them up.
Okay.
I had to figure out how. So I see fear, welcome, upbeat, friendly, tense, overwhelmed, uncomfortable.
Fear, irritation, relief, concerned, anxiety, hopeful, sad, frustrated, anxiety, fear, irritation, overwhelmed, uncertainty, fear and excitement, nervous, overwhelmed, concerned, anxious, distress, fear, uncertain, fear, anxiety, helpless. That's a new one. Burnout.
These are outstanding. Some other words we've heard in the past are things along this line, but also chaotic, electric, caring. So we'll come back to that. I think one of the important things, though, when we talk about how do we respond to the emotions of our patients, is to really reflect on some of these words. Like write them down, keep them, build your emotional word repertoire. Because what I find, particularly when I teach social work students, when we first start doing this exercise, I'll give them case scenarios, and the emotional word they most often use is frustrated. But it could be a horrible case scenario, like, I can't get in to see my mother who is in the hospital with COVID and I don't know how things are. And the response is, well, that's frustrating. Well, actually, it's a lot more than frustrating. It's heartbreaking, right? And so being able to help clients or patients identify those words is important. So for the purpose of today, when we talk about empathy, empathy is our ability to accurately demonstrate our understanding of the emotional experience of the client or of the patient. So I think a lot of times we think empathy is like, oh, Dale, I'm so glad you said that today. Well, that's a praise, and I'm showing gratefulness, but it's not the same thing as empathy. I'm not showing Dale that I really understand her emotional response to what's going on. So here's just a quote here. Sounds like you have been fearful. So there it is. That's the emotional word about what might happen to your family. There's a lot of unknown right now, and everything is changing really fast. So we're really trying to capture our understanding of what their experience is. And then the third thing that we want to focus on is how important it is to foster resilience. So, we've heard resilience, and we probably know firsthand, resilience is hard to come by these days, right? Like our tanks are feeling empty. But one of the things that we know, at least from the psychological literature, is that people are so much more likely to change their behavior if they can come up with solutions on their own. And so people are more likely to cope and use positive coping skills if they identify them themselves rather than me telling them what to do. And I'm sure right now, if you go out and find 10 of your close friends and tell them how they should cope, most of them are going to tell you why your solution is wrong, because that's our tendency, is when we're told what to do to resist, right? So what we have to do is help people find a way to cope. And we do that by asking coping questions. So, reminding them of that. So I go back to, I want you to help me think about a time that you've gotten through something that was really difficult. How did you do that? and really drawing upon that experience and figuring out how those coping skills can be applied here. I know that some of that is different for us too right now. You know, we can't do all of the same things. So, you know, that might mean that we have to make some modifications in terms of what those coping things are. So for example, you know, kids, you know, they want to go hang out with their friends and they want to see them face to face. Well, I can't give you that right now, but I can make sure that we have all the technology that you need so that between 4 and 5:30 that you can spend time on electronics doing that, right? So we're finding that particular way. I'm wondering, though, I'm going to pause and use the chat for a second. If you all can maybe share with us, are you hearing any positive coping stories from your own patients and caregivers that might be worth sharing? Because we can all learn from and build our own repertoire in that way. So if you have a positive coping strategy that you could share with us and type in the chat, that would be outstanding. Let's see. Some patients are learning new things, like new hobbies. Yes. Yoga and meditation, outstanding. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I actually, with my own mom, when all this happened and she was so isolated, and she's the most social human being in the world, and I was like, you can't go anywhere. And I reflected up to her, like, what was it that, you know, you went through some really hard times years ago. How did you do that? And she's like, well, I used to like to paint. And I was like, well, why don't you paint? And of course, she was like, well, I won't be any good at it. And I said, well, it's not about trying to sell it. It's about enjoying it, right? So faith, absolutely. Faith is a big source. A cooking show on YouTube. Oh my gosh, I love that.
That's wonderful.
Some are knitting masks. And you know what? I love that, because that actually is two things in one. I'm knitting, and that feels good to have my hands busy, but also finding a way to help other people really is an outstanding source of dealing with anxiety. Seeing the glass half full. Yes.
Gardening, house, getting things done in the house. Wow. Someone became a yoga instructor. Wow.
Yes.
That's, yeah.
So seeing the glass half full, you know, and that positive framework, I think that is also, this isn't in the slides that we're covering today, but I think that is an important piece, is helping people. You know, we get so stuck in how hard it is right now. Even I get stuck in that. And reframing and thinking about, well, what do I have control over? You know what? I don't, you know, I do compulsively check the news to see what's going on with COVID. And instead of that, I really need to focus on, I have learned, and I have a lot more information right now about what I can do to keep safe. And I'm grateful for that, and I know how to do it. So helping people reframe that way, I think, is an important piece too. I love this yoga piece as well, because also, as we're moving through this, just awareness of our body, and like, we can't hug and touch people in the same way. So having those kind of activities can be important as well. Okay. I'm going to move to the next slide. I'm sorry, it's taking a second for me to do this right. So there are a lot of resources out there about resilience. This is one that we really like that kind of came out right after COVID. So some tips. There are tons of stuff out there. CAPC has some outstanding resources available. The Social Work, Hospice, and Palliative Care Network also has a ton of resources available for responding to these kind of things. And certainly when we get to the end, I think we have our contact information. If we can provide more, you can email us, and we're happy to share.
And I've put that particular link into the chat if you want to copy it right now.
Wonderful. Okay, I think this is to you.
Okay. So we said we're going to talk about the dialysis center as a source of stability. So this builds a little bit on what Liz was saying, is how do we reframe things, or how, it's not just looking at it glass half full. I guess that's a reframing. So initially when COVID hit, I think people were, we were hearing reports of how stressed patients were with all the changes that were happening in the dialysis center. And that's difficult because the dialysis center is, this very routinized, you have your shift. Many people have their chair, and they have the who's going to bring them to dialysis. It's very routinized because it's something they're doing 3 times a week if they're doing in-center dialysis. So how do we help people kind of cope with all that change? So let's go to the next one. Next slide. So a big piece of it, we know you can't keep things the same as they were. And we know that in the first couple weeks, things changed daily, if not hourly, and even CDC would say do this, and then it would change. But now that we're learning, we have more evidence, we're learning more what we need to do. Maintaining some regularity is important. And when that is not possible, or in addition to that, letting people know that the change is coming, helping them prepare, again, normalizing that there is a lot of change because we're trying to do the best to keep everyone safe. And as we learn more, we improve, we adjust. And the other piece, it's not on the slide, but the other piece is to give people as much control, even if it's over small things. But even if you have to change somebody's chair, if you can say, would you like the one by the window, or would you like the one over there on the other side of the room? It's a little thing, but any little piece of control that you can give someone helps them adjust, helps them feel like they have some say, and it's not just all happening to them. They're not just being, bowled over by the wave of change. So maintaining the routine, preparing people for disruption, and then the third thing is helping them, giving them as much choice as you can. Let's go to the next slide. I think we wanted, before we went to this, I think we wanted to ask if you would chat in. Just let's go back one. What have you done? Do you have any suggestions? Have you seen any good ways that you've helped patients adjust? I know we've heard an awful lot about the level of distress and irritability and increased anger that there is in centers. Tara said she became a yoga instructor. What else have you done in your centers that has helped to foster that sense of here we are in the center together caring for each other? Just making time to talk about anything but COVID or dialysis. A pamphlet about local resources and reframing and mindfulness strategies and ways to deal with cabin fever. Yes. And if you can say, what are some of those ways to deal with cabin fever? That cabin fever is I think that should go on our emotional word list.
Right. I might need to steal some of the ideas too.
Educational boards for the lobby. What are you putting on the boards? I'd be interested. Is it about COVID or other things? Yeah, these are great. So, and home projects, okay, gratitude journal, stretching, audiobooks. I have been using audiobooks. Breathing, self-care, participation in virtual support groups, wonderful, yes. It's surprising how much people are able to get from virtual. Fun activities, great. Bingo and ice cream. You're doing that in the dialysis center. That's fantastic. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so now we're going to move to our kind of our third area, which is responding when a patient has died. And it's not just a patient, it could actually be a member of their family. We've heard some really, really tragic stories about family members of dialysis patients dying. I'm still seeing the chat, new program of peer mentoring. A bulletin board with something positive that they gained from the pandemic. Great.
That's great.
Thank you. So this is an area that has not typically been part of dialysis center practice, is my understanding. I mean, some dialysis centers will have a little memory board, but it's not as common as the fact that dialysis patients do die. That is a very common experience for patients, staff of dialysis center. But how to cope with that? My experience has been that the typical response has been, we need to encourage, we don't want to scare patients, and we need to encourage that we're their health, and that has sort of shown being able to acknowledge that someone has died and to honor their memory. And I want to suggest that we think it's going to be scary to patients when a patient dies, and then they're going to think, am I next? And indeed, it may be scary. They may be thinking, am I next? But it can also be comforting, because one of the things that many people really worry about is, when I die, will anybody remember me? Or how will I be remembered? And will I have a lasting impact? What's the legacy? So it can be very comforting to see how other patients are being remembered and honored. So that's a frame. That's how I want to help you reframe the notion that holding memorials or having memorial processes is scary. It can also be comforting. And ritual can help us. Again, that regularity, if there's a ritual, that can help us cope. Let's go to the next slide. HIPAA gets in the way, someone's chatting in. It sure does, and there are a few things around it. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So I just spoke about this, that we sort of work ourselves into a conspiracy of silence if we're too afraid of ginning up the grief and the sadness and the fear in other patients. But the reality is that the patient is already sitting with that heightened awareness, especially now during COVID. And we're seeing that people are more open to talking about advanced care plans and thinking about what they might want if they were to get sick. I wonder if, again, I'd invite in the chat if that's been your experience or not. So when someone has been sitting next to somebody else, or been on the same shift and been in the waiting room with them for 3 years, or been on the same van pickup route, and that person suddenly isn't there, they're gonna wonder what happened. And sometimes people don't feel empowered to ask. So how do we deal with that? Let's go to the next slide. So, wait, I talked about this. We can go to the next one.
Oh, are you wanting, do you want me to advance? I think I know where you want to go, but I think
We'll get to that, but we'll do this since it's here. Yeah, so these are the words. I'll talk about HIPAA later, but yes, so handing the ball back to you, Liz.
Okay. So we really wanted to give you all just some tools and words to use, because I think sometimes, particularly when we also are in that fight or flight moment, it's hard to know exactly what to say. One of the things that we've heard over and over again is how important it is when we have to deliver bad news, like telling the patients that another patient has died, is how important it is for us to show care and concern. And we also hear over and over again how important transparency and honesty is. And we know that that's integral to having a positive climate and culture and where we work. So you can see this first quote. I'm going to read it just in case people have called in. We are like family here, and I have some really difficult news to share. Given how much I care about each of you, I wanted to tell you myself. Unfortunately, Mrs. Smith has died. And so, being very careful on how we tell that we're conveying that care, and we're proving to them that we care by sharing that ourselves instead of them hearing that from somebody else, which is also how oftentimes, myths come up as well. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit about that in the piece. And when we say that, I really urge you to pause. So one of the things when I look at process recordings from, or videotape recordings from social workers and sometimes other healthcare professionals, when we get nervous, which this can be a really nervous kind of conversation, we tend to just like explode with words and go on and on and on. And I think in some ways we do that because we know if we stop, there's going to maybe be some uncomfortableness with emotion. And yet, as we've already described, that piece needs to happen and people need to have space for that. So pause. In the social work world, we talk a lot about containment and that this idea that we are an open container, that we can tolerate negative emotion and that people are safe with that. And pausing and silence does that. So we deliver the bad news and then we pause and let them respond. And we pay attention to what is that emotion that is happening. They're probably not going to tell us a lot. Most people aren't going to tell us the emotion they feel. We're going to try to pick up on that and check it out. And we can do that with this last square at the bottom by saying, this is heartbreaking for me. There's heartbreaking for you, right? Whatever is appropriate here. But that's the emotion word. This is heartbreaking. It is okay to be really upset or even angry. So we are telling them up front, I can tolerate your emotion. It's okay. We are here to support you and to listen to you. We may not know the answers, but we're in this together. And so in doing that, that's a real partnering statement, but we're also letting them know that they are safe. And I know that a lot of times the fear is that if we give people permission, that it's just going to blow up. But oftentimes when we give people permission, it really diffuses. And so that's sort of how we see telling that. Now, having said that, this also requires an element of you of self-care. So that means that in order for you to come to work every day or before you interact with any patients, that you're taking a moment to also check in with yourself, because dealing with your own grief and loss is bound to have an emotional impact too. And so we spend some time talking about how important, you might feel really selfish to take a 15-minute walk every morning, yet it's probably going to make you show up and be present and engaged in a much more meaningful way that's going to make everybody's day better. So knowing that self-care piece and seeking out your own support is important. So similarly, how do we respond when a patient's loved one died? And we've heard lots of stories of, multiple loved ones dying in the dialysis unit. So first thing that we would say is acknowledge it and use their name. We have here use their first name, but if you actually always called them Mrs. Smith or Mr. Smith, then of course use that. But use their name and acknowledge them. And if there's anything that you can remember about that person, state it. So, Linda had the most cheerful smile. I always could tell that James loved you. making that personal. Likewise, you know, even if you don't have a chance to say those things face to face, when you're writing sympathy cards to people, that is an important piece, using their name and remembering something about them. And then after you do that same thing, pause and let them respond. You know, usually when we say that kind of thing, people spill it. You know, I reflect on my bereavement counseling days, and I can remember patients saying to me, or caregivers saying to me, nobody lets me talk about this anymore. Nobody wants to hear, you know, anything about Tom. And so just being thoughtful and allowing some of that, allowing that emotion, and again, naming it. It is so heartbreaking and such a great loss for you to bear. And then finally, letting them know that you can tolerate that emotion. Something like this can really make a person overwhelmed, angry, and devastated. Again, we're naming it. You are safe to talk about that with me. And also, you know, it's okay to say, you're safe to talk about that with me. And if I can help you, then, you know, I'm going to. And if I can't, I want to, and I'm going to help you find the right person. So I see a comment here during COVID. It's been so hard because I can't hug any of the patients when they're upset like this. And I can only imagine that that is true. I actually interviewed a lot of people this summer about how do you display empathy and respond when you can't do telehealth, but also when you're wearing PPE and standing 6 feet apart. And I think that actually we as professionals might be suffering almost more because we're wired, right, to comfort people with our bodies. That's what we do with babies when they're born. We hold them, and that's how we calm them down. So we're really familiar with that. And now we're being asked to respond a different way. You know, one of the things I think that is helpful, though not perfect, is to just name it and say it. You know, I wish I could hug you right now. If I could be with you right now, I would want to give you a big hug. So really articulating that piece. But the other thing is, I think that is important to recognize is, what is it about hugging that makes our clients feel better? And that is that it calms down our parasympathetic systems. So that touch really soothes our physiological response. But you know what? We have these outstanding mirror neurons that are very capable of picking up on other people. And so if you can enter into the relationship in that calm, compassionate, loving place, you're going to bring that same response out. But it does mean that you're going to have to spend a little bit more time there. You're going to probably have to spend more time on the relationship and building trust and being present than you did before if you can't have that physical piece. That's a sad note. Thank you for sharing that. And, you know, this really kind of coincides with that. The importance of your presence. You know, words are important. They are. But more important is your presence. More important is that you show up and you sit with people in their pain. And that's what people notice. When I talk to patients in my own research about when a provider is going to have a serious illness conversation with you, maybe about something life or death, what is most important to you? Overwhelmingly, people say, I just want them to sit with me. Just be with me, right? So your presence is so important, that tolerating part. Because these folks are really alone and lonely and of course isolated. And even if you're doing it on telehealth, you can sit and be present with people across a video camera. You don't have to say much. And you might screw it up if you say something. That's okay too. You can apologize. My experience is when I have botched up conversations and I've come back and apologized, that it's just created a stronger relationship because I've been authentic and genuine. But letting people know that you're here for them is also enough. So the do's and don'ts when talking about this with your family or with patient members and your family. You can use this with your family too. So don't try to fix it. Sometimes we need to try to fix it, but right now, when you're in the middle of something emotional, allow it to happen and be present. Don't discourage those emotions. Do not persuade them to take on a different view. Remembering this is a subjective experience. And don't get distracted in the conversation. You know, it is so hard, and I'm still learning how to not get distracted. But close your browsers if you're doing telehealth. Turn your phone off. Really focus on who you are there in the moment. You're going to be much more efficient that way anyway. But do, reflect and name back that emotion. Let them know you can tolerate it. Like you said, be present. Shared quiet is connection building. And when it is time to say something, you can say, take your time. I'm here. This isn't a rush. Sometimes people are silent because they're overwhelmed with their own feelings. Sometimes people just need to process. I need to process. And so allowing some space for that is really healthy as well. Okay, back to you, Dale.
Yeah, and before I move to this, I just want to make two small comments. One is we did talk about when you're breaking the news of a death of another patient to use that person's name, or when you're talking about the name if a patient's family members died, use their name. There are just two small exceptions to that. And if you're working in communities that have people from different cultural backgrounds, so for instance, the Navajo, it's a taboo to say the name of someone who has died. So presumably you would know that if you're working in that community, and you'll need to become aware of the appropriate way to do that. And some there are some other cultures where you don't use the name. So just be aware of the cultural practices. The other thing, Liz knows I'm an improvisationist. Just responding to the comment about not being able to hug, I just wonder if anybody has tried, and would anybody be willing to try, asking somebody to imagine, like, I wish I could hug you right now. Can you just take a minute and imagine that that I've got my arm around your shoulder and I'm right next to you? Because as Liz was saying, we have that power of imagination that can calm the nervous system as well. So anyway, that was my little
great point.
Yeah, just my little improv. So now what we'd like you to chat in. Someone said they put in a light and an electric candle. So what else are you guys doing about memorial practices? Here are some, I won't read them to you, but here are some that other dialysis facilities use. And I'd be interested which of you actually do bereavement cards, and what has your experience of that been? The concern that we hear often about doing it is they won't know what to say, or that it's going to take too much time. And the actual experience, I think, of doing them, hopefully you're only having, other in COVID it might be a little different, but you only have 1 or 2 deaths a month, so it's not that big a deal. And the experience of writing those cards can give the staff closure. If everybody on the staff signs it, it can be good for the staff to do that, not just for the patient to receive it. And then mostly when family not the patient, the family members, when family get it, they're very appreciative usually. So The other thing in terms of rituals, so somebody in the chat said they've got an electric candle. You can talk with, if this is not something you do, I would talk with your local hospice chaplain, who are very good at designing rituals, and they could help you think about what might work in your space, or hospital chaplain. So there is a bereavement card at your facility, great. You send bereavement cards to family, right? Patients and you have patients sign them. Oh, wonderful. That's fantastic. Yeah, and somebody said that it is helpful for staff when you sign it. Wonderful. Thank you. So just encourage those of you who haven't been doing it. I think you'll find it's a good process. So someone raised the issue of HIPAA, and I don't want to give you legal advice, and of course you should vet this with the people who help you with HIPAA compliance. But I would say two things about it. One is, if there is something that's been published in the, your local paper, an obituary, that's public information then, and so you certainly can display that. And some folks do have an in memoriam board. You can also post things that other patients or the family members bring in. So if the family brought you, let's say, a little in memoriam display about someone who died, or if patients were to write their memories about someone who died, those are not HIPAA problems. So there are ways to stay compliant with HIPAA and still honor those memories. Let's go to the next slide.
Hold on, I'm trying.
Okay. So, someone said, let's see, we used to do a bereavement card where all staff signed or wrote a note to the family, but I recently started excluding everyone's comments because I thought it might be too overwhelming. So if you want, could you amplify that? Too overwhelming for the family, is that what you were concerned about? Or too overwhelming for your staff? For the family. Did you get, I'm curious. I wish we could talk, but in this webinar, we don't. So if you'll keep chatting to us. Did you get feedback from the family that it was overwhelming? Did you have an instance where somebody told you that? Because mostly people love getting those cards, so I'm curious. And so while you're thinking about what more you can tell us about that, here in the slides, you'll be able to get these. These are some other resources about COVID-ready communication on difficult subjects. So Vital Talk, which is, if you don't know about Vital Talk, I highly recommend it. They've put together a document that just gives you the words to say in difficult situations related to COVID. And the Social Work, Hospice, and Palliative Care Network has put together some good resources on working with families during COVID. And then there's the field manual for palliative care in a humanitarian crisis. We are certainly in a crisis now. And so some of that, if you're wanting to read something a little more scholarly, but the first two are quick, kind of actionable, here are things to say and do. Yeah, okay, no feedback but just you started writing your own note. Okay, great. So we conclude our slides, and we have a few minutes left, so we would love to open to your questions. And I think we had instructions that you should put questions into the Q&A panel, I think because of the way it records it. So please go ahead and do that. And while you're doing that, thinking about your questions, I was supposed to read you an announcement about your CE credits before we started. So I'm going to read that now. So for attending this webinar, there's one continuing education credit available to all nurse and social work attendees who pre-registered and who attend today's event, including filling out the evaluation form at the end. Continuing education credit forms will be emailed within 1 month of the event to each attendee who meets pre-registration and attendance requirements. So please do the evaluation, which we'll be talking about in a minute. So in the Q&A, will slides be shared with participants? Yes, but we're happy to, maybe the host could tell us how that's going to happen. I don't know the mechanism for that.
Yes, we will either send them if somebody sends in a specific request, or often we'll send them to all the participants.
Okay, we're happy to have you send them to all the participants.
And we're recording this, so we'll have a YouTube presentation as well, and that will probably be on the website of Network 5, Quality Insight.
Great. Other questions? Other, or if you want to chat or put in the Q&A now, if you want to put in any situations that you're experiencing that you think we could respond to that we haven't covered.
One of the things, just while we're waiting, just to respond to Ashley's comment about, not wanting to be overwhelming, I think it is important that we all do think about not causing harm, right? And I think that's what Ashley is reflecting on, not wanting to cause harm. And, it's tricky because silence can also cause harm. And that's why it's important for us to know sort of what the evidence says and so forth. I think for the most part in the bereavement community, cards tend to be very safe because people can choose when to read them. So, when my phone rings, I can't necessarily choose it. Or if I walk outside and my neighbors bombard me with asking me about this situation, I can't avoid it. But cards tend to be safe because I can say, I don't want to read this right now. So just a point to consider in terms of how you are following up with family. It gives them, like Dale was saying, a little bit of control.
I'm so glad to see so many of you are doing cards. That's really, it's so helpful. One of the things just I hear from family members when someone's died, it's like they were cared for in this hospital or this nursing home or this dialysis center, wherever they were, and nobody's ever said to us, sort of, we're sorry, or we, I don't know, it just, there's a closure that the care providers can give to the family that's just very important, with something as simple as a bereavement letter or a card. Yeah. Well, I think I will read you about the completion of the evaluation form. When you exit this webinar, you will need to click on a continue button to take you to an evaluation form. To receive your CE credit, we ask you to please complete the short evaluation form now. And Liz and I thank you so much for your time, for listening. And please, in the evaluation form, I hope there's an open-ended, and give us any feedback that would help us as revise this or have it more helpful. We have one more HIPAA also on my mind. Not clear how staff can share with patient staff with other patients without violating HIPAA. Yes, you can ask family members if you can share. And by the time you get the document about funeral wake, it's likely that patients will hear rumors. I think this is something worth taking to your HIPAA person. I don't want to give you bad advice, and every institution handles this a little different, but people who are dead aren't covered by HIPAA in the same way. That I know is true, but I think you should take it to your HIPAA person and say, we need to find a way that works, that respects HIPAA, but respects the emotional needs of our patients. And hopefully your HIPAA compliance person is knowledgeable and flexible and will help you problem solve. So here's a great suggestion. Our dialysis center has a form patient sign that give us permission to celebrate different things, and this also includes acknowledging after death to others in the facility. Fantastic. Thank you. It's so great when you guys can share with each other and support each other in really spreading best practice. That is fantastic. Yeah. Well, thank you again. We really appreciate, Liz and I love having the chance to hear about your experience, and hopefully this is helpful to you and helps fill your tank. We're just running on empty because there's of care providers. And we know many of you also have family responsibilities. Thank you. Someone said, awesome presentation. I'm glad you felt it was helpful. So we really enjoy the time being with you. And like we said, we wish we could be in a room together and see you and
we are dreaming of the day.
God blessing. So thank you so much, and please hit that continue button when you get out so you can do the evaluation, get your CE credits, and give us feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.
May, should we leave, or do you want us to stay on for a minute?
I think you can leave, and we will send the evaluation form around tomorrow, let you know what comments people had.
Wonderful.
Okay. And did you see in the chat before that someone was asking that the evaluation form be sent to a different email?
Yes, we can do that. They'll contact, and yes, I saw that. Thank you for reminding me.
You got that.
Kelly Brooks will take care of that as well. Yes. Thank you, guys. It was wonderful. Really excellent.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.